Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining the DAP team's webinar today, Justifying the Web Analyst's Role in Your Organization. We want to give a big thank you to the DigitalGov team, as always, for their support in helping us present these webinars out to the federal government community. I want to also thank everyone for taking the time today to join this webinar in light of everything that's happening in the world. I know everyone is probably a bit stressed, but we want to thank you very much for your attention and for caring enough to come to today's webinar. And we hope it will be a useful webinar for your team when you're thinking about how to build out an analytics capability. So my name is Freddie Blicker. I am an analyst on the DAP program led by Tim Loudon. And today I'm going to be speaking about an interesting topic. So today's webinar is entitled Justifying the Web Analyst's Role in Your Organization. So the goal here is I'm going to go through some ideas around strategy and how you and your team need to be thinking about this. And if there are any questions, if we have enough time towards the end, by all means, please enter those questions into the chat window. Tim is monitoring the chat, and we'll be happy to brainstorm with you. After today's webinar, we would really appreciate it if you could fill out the survey. We really appreciate the community's feedback on our content and any thoughts that you might have on future webinars. So let's dive in. What we'll cover today. We're going to be talking about what is a web analyst and what does the web analyst role look like. So we're going to talk about some common characteristics and typical tasks that a web analyst does in their day-to-day job. We're also going to speak about different models of analytics teams and how a web analyst integrates into those teams. We'll talk some about how you can justify having a web analyst role on your team. And then on top of that, we're going to be talking about how do you start to think about making the business case for a web analyst to your leadership. And not only that, we're going to also discuss how to think about how many web analysts do you actually need. So let's step back and just kind of take a 30,000-foot view of why we're doing this topic today. So at the DAP program, we often get emails from folks across the government about how they need to be thinking about justifying having a web analyst or a team of web analysts at an agency. And this is a very interesting topic, and a lot of people are asking about it. So that's what really went into us deciding to do this webinar, to impart our experiences and hopefully connect various folks here on the webinar with information that's going to help empower you, go back to your team to make the business case. So we've got a couple challenges to talk about. So our first challenge that we're all up against is that every organization, every federal agency is different. And the unique needs of your organization really help determine what type of web analyst you need to hire. It also helps you determine what skills that person needs to have, right? A web analyst is a profession in which there are very diverse skill sets. These are broad and diverse. There is no one size fits all. And so I'm sure everyone on this webinar today is probably wondering, where do you even begin thinking about how do you know which skill sets are appropriate for your team? And how many people should we even hire? And how should we organize these teams? Are there any models that we can follow to help organize our team in the most effective way to yield the most effective results? Our second challenge is that every website looks at reporting differently, and your website has unique needs. Your reporting requirements are going to help determine who you need to hire and what skills that person needs. Now, this is something that we on the DAP program can't tell you how to do this. You at your agency need to take a good, hard, strategic look at what types of reporting requests you get from your senior leadership. What is the current level of effort in number of hours? Do you have technical support from your web development team, and so forth? These are all things that go into figuring out what type of web analyst you need to hire and how you need to organize your web analytics team. Now, a common scenario that we see all the time across the federal government is that analytics is typically an add-on job on top of somebody's regular job. Now, this is great, and the DAP program is here to help guide everyone who needs access to Google Analytics data. We're here to help guide them through that journey, right? But when somebody has a day job and then the analytics is an add-on job on top of that, it leaves little time to focus, progress, and develop the analytics skill sets that your team really needs, right? Typically, we see reporting focus is looking at very basic metrics like page views, right? And if you look at just page views or very basic metrics, they don't really reveal any useful insights or help you tell a story. Now, another thing in this common scenario that we see in government today is that there are typically no defined website mission, goals, and KPIs, otherwise known as key performance indicators. These are typically not defined by whoever is pulling analytics data. And this in turn makes it difficult to tell a meaningful story in the context of your website. So these are the kind of the three main bullet points that I'm sure resonate with folks on the webinar today. These are the types of things that we run into all the time in the federal government space when we're looking at data analytics and specifically web analytics. So let's talk a little bit about hiring a web analyst. Now, the type of analyst you need really depends on two things: your business need and who you already have or don't have to support you. That's really the two main things that you need to be thinking about as we go through today's webinar. Now, some examples of things that you need to be thinking about as we go through today's material is, do you need technical talent? So for example, do you have a website where your development team is stretched thin and they don't have enough hours to work on Google Tag Manager? So perhaps you might need a web analyst who is an expert at Google Tag Manager. Do you need quality assurance testing talent, QA talent, right? Do you have somebody on your web development team who's able to fill that function today of QAing the implementation of Google Analytics? Or do you need to hire a web analyst who has that experience? Another thing to think about, do you need reporting support? How many people are doing reporting today? Is it effective to spread that reporting function across 6 or 7 different people, or would it make more sense to have one person who has expertise in this area and then can pull these reports and synthesize the data in a more efficient way? And then additionally, do you have the support today to help tell a story about the data? How do you strategically message your senior leadership about the efficiency and about the success of your website through the Google Analytics data? Now, storytelling does not involve communicating number of page views. This is a challenge in the government space because we're not like e-commerce where we're selling things where we can communicate in revenue or in orders, right? We need to align our websites with understanding the higher level analytic strategy of your website mission, goals, and KPIs. So do you need somebody who's able to handle this strategic messaging and figuring out your analytic strategy and how that plays into how you're going to tell the story of your website success to your senior management? And then finally, marketing support. Do you have somebody that it fills this function today with marketing support for social media, press releases, email campaigns? These are all things that you need to be thinking about. If you have gaps in any of these areas, that's a really good way of identifying the types of characteristics, the types of skill sets that you need to be looking for in a web analyst when you actually go out and try to hire them. Okay, so what is a web analyst? This is the question we get all the time. I included the count here because he's the world's least effective web analyst because all he does is count. He doesn't tell a story, right? And as web analysts, we need to be able to not only have technical chops, but be able to use the reporting to pull out data, analyze that data, glean insights from that data, right? We are not here just to count the number of page views. We are here to tell a story and improve processes at our various federal agencies. So let's talk a little bit about what is a web analyst. Well, a web analyst is simply a person serving as a strategic advisor who turns raw, disparate data sets from analytics, marketing, and different survey tools into actionable insights. So this person is going to help an organization make better business decisions. This is not just pulling reports and reporting on the number of page views. That is not something that a web analyst does. A web analyst takes it to the next level by being able to synthesize the data, glean insights, and tell a story. Now, I should note here that a web analyst is not limited to Google Analytics or web analytics data. This applies to marketing folks, marketing platforms, survey data. The list goes on. Any data that is available, a web analyst can use that data, analyze it, and glean insights from it. Now, a web analyst from a Google Analytics perspective exists to help an organization improve their website by analyzing data sets through the lens of an organization's website mission, goals, and KPIs. So if you have various folks pulling data at your agency today, and they are not aligning those reports with your website's mission, goals, and KPIs, then that's going to be really challenging for your team to communicate your team's success to senior management. If you hired a web analyst, this could be a really good opportunity to really come up with a compelling story from the data to actually communicate how successful your website is to your senior management. Now, web analysts can exist in any organization. That can be e-commerce, nonprofit, federal government, automobile. The list goes on. Anywhere where there's a website or data sets to be analyzed, marketing data, survey data, you can have a web analyst. So the main point here is that a web analyst can be a person with a broad and diverse set of skills, and they're not limited to just web analytics data or website data or email data. They can touch any type of data set and make sense from that data. Now, from a website perspective, which is primarily what DAP is looking at, web analysts look at things like web usability, how different marketing traffic influences conversion, website mission, goals, KPIs. The list goes on. Now, I will say, in my experience, I have seen all different types of web analysts. I've worked with philosophy majors, web developers, marketing majors. Some of my colleagues over the years have had MBAs, PhDs, BAs. Some web analysts are technical, others aren't at all technical. Some technical web analysts know how to implement the tool, but they don't know how to use the tool or interpret the data. So this is a very broad and diverse field, and there are pitfalls that you need to be aware of when figuring out who you need to hire and why. But overall, I would say that one of the most important characteristics of a web analyst is that they're passionate about learning and figuring out complex problems. They're comfortable with the gray area, and they're genuinely interested in interesting data, challenges, and problems. So really that desire to learn, that passion for learning and navigating the gray area in disparate data sets is really key when you're thinking about what is a web analyst. Now, some additional characteristics, very high level, of a web analyst that folks on this webinar need to be aware of. When you're stepping back and thinking about, okay, who on my team, or maybe there's a federal team that exists at your agency, or maybe you're looking at a contracting company, you need to be thinking about the following kind of high-level characteristics. You need to be thinking about, does this person have analytics tool expertise? That could be Google Analytics, it could be Adobe, it could be email, marketing analytics data, whatever the case may be. Do they have that expertise? Does this person tell stories using the data, or are they simply looking at page views? There's a very big distinction there, as I've mentioned before. You need somebody who's able to glean insights and tell a story, not just send an Excel file full of data about page views. Additionally, you need to be thinking about, does this web analyst have the ability to visualize data? Do they have expertise in Tableau or Google Data Studio or Excel? All of these tools, you can build beautiful charts, beautiful visualizations to communicate to your end users and to your senior leadership. And those charts, those visuals, help you tell a story. So this is a very key, important part of who a web analyst is and who you need to hire. Additionally, you need to be thinking about technical expertise. Does this person have experience doing web development? Do they know Google Tag Manager? Do they kind of know just enough to be dangerous, or do they not know anything? Like, you need to be aware of the different skill sets in terms of how technical a web analyst is. And then finally, domain expertise, right? There's a lot of gray area in being a web analyst. There's a lot of different technologies that different web analysts focus on and others don't focus on. So you need to be aware of what is their total domain expertise. We have a link here to some more ideas on what to think about when you're thinking of various folks either internally at your agency or with a company. But these are kind of the high-level characteristics that you need to be thinking about and assessing any person that you want to hire on as a web analyst. Okay, let's talk about some common tasks of a web analyst. And specifically, I'm thinking more in the direction of DAP, because this is a DAP webinar, right? So we're going to think about, website data. But these are kind of all the common tasks that a web analyst looking at website data is thinking about and working with, right? So a web analyst is typically looking at how the data is collected via Google Analytics or another analytics tool. Is that data clean, right? Or is the data potentially sampled, or is there double counting, right? Are there technical issues causing the data to not be clean? Common task is analyzing the data, right? Looking at the trends. Analytics is not accounting, and data is directional. We need to be thinking as web analysts about what's the story that the data is telling. We shouldn't be counting page views, right? We need to be analyzing the data with the goal of telling a story. And then additionally here we have data visualization, right? Depending on what the story is, how do we communicate this to our senior leadership? Most people are visual learners and learn and understand by visual aids. And so this is the value of having somebody who's able to use a Tableau or a Google Data Studio to communicate visually the story of the data set. Also, a web analyst is always thinking about and trying to align with their organization's website mission, goals, and KPIs. This is key, because if an organization is looking at their website mission, goals, and KPIs, they're never going to be pulling just page views in a vacuum. They're going to be using the website mission, goals, and KPIs to help prioritize areas of the site that are important to your organization's mission. Additionally, analysts are going to be creating reports in Excel, Google Data Studio, Microsoft BI, Tableau, Google Sheets, right? The goal here is to not stay in Google Analytics the whole time, but to find a data set and get it out of the tool and start analyzing it and creating beautiful dashboards and communicating your success with those dashboards, right? And so a big part of that is report presentation and storytelling. But ultimately, analysts need to be thinking about how they make recommendations based off of the data and the insights they've uncovered. The goal here is to make recommendations, not report on page views in a vacuum. Additionally, analysts work with content teams, usability teams, design teams to implement changes, and they also work on a lot of A/B testing. So there's a lot of stuff, there's a lot of tasks that a web analyst needs to be involved in and is typically involved in. So you need to be aware of these things as you're thinking about what qualities of an analyst are most important to my organization when we're thinking about hiring a web analyst. I'll give you a quick example about me. So I'm a Google Analytics consultant at MetroStar Systems, and I support the DAP program at the GSA as a web analyst. So my previous experience is pretty varied. I've worked mostly in the private sector at a lot of different hotel companies, e-commerce companies in San Francisco, and I have focused on different areas of being a web analyst throughout my career. So there was a time where I only did technical implementation with web trends and with Google Analytics. I didn't really go into the reporting piece of web trends, for example. So I only worked on the implementation, and that is a specific skill set of a web analyst, right? There have been times where I've only focused on reporting on marketing analytics using Adobe and Google Analytics. There have been times in different jobs where I've only worked on reporting and strategy with web trends, IBM, Adobe, and Google Analytics. So the type of web analyst that I like to describe of myself is that I'm a combination of technical and reporting skills with the ability to kind of translate business requirements between developers and bridge that gap between end users and senior leadership. So I kind of have a foot in kind of both areas, right? I'm not a developer, but I know just enough to be dangerous to be able to communicate the business needs so that the developers can help me implement that, right? So there's a lot of nuance here in figuring out what type of web analyst you need, right? Do you possibly need a developer web analyst, or do you need somebody like me? That really is going to depend on how your organization is set up and what are your specific needs. Now, I do want to point out that duties of a web analyst can spread beyond analytics. Specifically, you can be looking at social, email, usability, A/B testing, right? I mean, there's a lot of things that go into this recipe for what is a web analyst. Okay, so let's talk about kind of the four main focus areas. In my experience and from my research, these are kind of the four areas that you typically see at larger companies. Now, I'm certainly not advocating for everyone on this webinar to build out teams with these functions because more than likely, you are not going to be able to build a team of 50 or 60 web analysts like a company like Macy's could do. But I bring up this kind of framework here to let you know how intense and how challenging analytics is. And the fact that there are silos of web analysts focusing in all these different areas vertically, but also horizontally. And that's what makes this challenging, okay? So typically, the first focus area you're gonna see is the implementation, right? The implementation area. Oftentimes you'll see there's an implementation team. That's literally all these web analysts do, is how to make the analytics tool work correctly. You'll typically see them QA new custom dimensions and metrics, code new enhancements. They need to know things like JavaScript, the data layer, using Google Tag Manager, using other tag management software, So that's a really important piece of the puzzle, because if you don't have the tool implemented correctly, you're not going to get the correct data, right? And in the analytics world, we always speak about the concept of garbage in, garbage out. If you are tracking your data incorrectly, you're not going to get useful data that you can use to infer and identify trends and tell a meaningful story to your end users and your senior leadership. The next main focus area is reporting. So these are folks, these are web analysts that are typically pulling data from the tool. So for example, from DAP, people go in there, pull data, report on it, analyze it. Typically, these folks are the ones interpreting the data and creating insights. You'll typically see an on-site web analyst or team where they're just looking at things like the navigation or on-site search or the usability and the UX of various pages. How are people interacting with the site itself, right? And you can also see offsite, so marketing web analysts who are looking at all of the marketing channels sending traffic to your website and figuring out, does SEO or does paid search or does email or social convert at a higher rate than the other channels, right? Does one of those work better? That's what a marketing web analyst is looking at. But the main thing in common here is that the reporting analysts are analyzing data with Excel, Google Data Studio, Tableau. They're creating dashboards. They're communicating their findings and they're making recommendations. They're not pulling page views. The next focus area is reporting automation. So typically in a large organization, you have a lot of senior leadership and various teams that rely on the data to make business decisions. So you typically will see a team of web analysts that only focuses on scaling the creation of dashboards, either in Excel, Google Data Studio, Tableau, to make it easier and more efficient for your internal customers to get the data and the reports that they need to make decisions, right? So these folks, the reporting automation folks, are typically looking at, they're using APIs, they're setting up complex formulas, they're streamlining report creation via macros in Excel. They're doing a lot of the technical implementation of the reports themselves. And then finally, the fourth main focus area is advanced analytics. So these are typically the data scientists. These are the PhDs or the quants focusing on statistical analysis, and they're correlating different data sets. So for example, at Macy's, just an example from my professional career, the advanced analytics folks would take website data and they'd correlate that data with weather trend data to figure out where they needed to send extra product to different areas, different geographic regions of the US. And so they were able to infer and identify interesting insights that would help them pull the lever on figuring out, do we send more jackets or a certain type of brand up to the New York area versus California? So that's kind of what the advanced analytics folks are doing, right? They're also looking at multi-touch attribution, and a lot of these teams are generating analytical models using machine learning today. So there's a lot of really complex, interesting correlational analysis and statistics happening on this advanced analytics team. So there's a lot going on here. So this is all to really kind of drive home the point that there are many skill sets in many areas in which web analysts work in, and you need to be aware of these and what your business need is, because that's going to cascade throughout your decision-making on who you need to hire as your web analyst. Now, just to kind of talk about DAP in the context of today's webinar. Now, the previous slide showed the four focus areas, right? We've got implementation, we've got reporting for off-site marketing, on-site engagement. We've got reporting automation, we've got advanced analytics. DAP is an amazing resource for the federal government community, and DAP has really empowered the federal government community to receive most of the benefits of the previous slide with only 2 team members. So this is that we're giving you a lot of this support out of the GSA to help you and empower you with your reporting. Now, obviously, we don't do the advanced analytics piece. That's a whole other thing. but we cover the majority of what you saw on the previous slide with only 2 team members. So let's talk about a couple different models of analytics teams and how the analyst integrates into those teams. So there's really, in my experience, 5 main teams. You got the implementation team, you have the on-site reporting team, right? General site performance, site enhancements, navigation. You get the off-site marketing analytics team, looking at only social media, email, paid search, all the traffic that you're sending to that website. You've got the reporting automation team, like I mentioned previously. You've got the advanced analytics team. Now, you could potentially set up teams like this, but really, again, we want to drive home that your organization and your level of web development support, the number of hours available, your reporting needs, really are going to determine what hats from all of these 5 main teams your web analyst needs to wear, because in all likelihood, you're not going to be able to create 5 different teams that do all this stuff, nor would you need to within the federal government context. Now, you know, obviously in government, most teams are not going to be dealing with any e-commerce data. And this is really going to make it super important and key that your agency has defined its website mission, goals, and KPIs. If this is something that your organization is still struggling with, by all means, please reach out to the DAP team after today's webinar. Happy to brainstorm on that with you. But whoever is pulling reporting at your organization today needs to be viewing the data through the lens of your website mission, goals, and KPIs. Now, I should also drive home the point here that, you know, configuration of all of your different types of analytics tools, whether that be Google Analytics, Google Tag Manager, your email marketing platform, your social media accounts, all these analytics tools, you need to be aware about how they're configured. And I bring that up because, like I mentioned before, we have the concept of garbage in, garbage out. You can't get anything meaningful or useful out of your data sets if your tools are configured incorrectly. So the takeaway here is that your mileage is going to vary, and how you integrate your analyst into your team is really going to depend on what areas from these 5 main teams, what skill sets from these 5 main teams you need that analyst to have. That's not something the DAP team can tell you. That has to be a strategic discussion that happens at your agency. Okay, let's think about this another way. I like to think about this in 3 approaches. So there's a lot of gray area here, right? You know, in the previous approach where I mentioned the 5 teams, that's an effective setup for a large company. The problem is that it's very siloed. That's why it is effective. But the problem is it's not flexible. Oftentimes in a siloed approach, you'll have the implementation team implementing, but they're not necessarily talking with the reporting team who needs to see a certain outcome from the implementation. And so oftentimes you'll have miscommunication between the implementation team and the reporting team. Now, the next approach is hire a contracting firm or use a designated federal team that may already exist at your agency to handle all of these functions. Now, this is the most effective approach here. Typically, these folks know enough about each of those kind of 5 teams and skill set areas where they're able to advise you. Right? Now, your mileage here is going to vary as well, because not every government agency has a federal team that can handle all those functions. Also, not every contracting firm has this type of capability. So it's, you know, this leads you to a place where you really need to have those strategic discussions at your agency about what your needs are before you can figure out which approach makes sense to you. Now, the third final approach that I typically see in the federal government space is what I like to call spray and pray. This is the least effective approach. This is essentially spreading the job of a web analyst and its function across multiple people who already have day jobs and with very different levels of understanding of Google Analytics. Oftentimes there's expertise, but with little to no centralized reporting function. So there's varying levels of expertise here. Sometimes you'll have somebody, a colleague or a coworker who just pulls page views. And then sometimes you'll have a colleague or coworker who knows how to tell a story from data. It's really hit or miss, and it really depends on the person who's being assigned this type of work. So this is really the least effective. Now, one thing to point out here is that if the level of effort and the number of hours does not justify having a full-time web analyst role, you could still have this be a significant part of the official duties of somebody at your agency. But really, if you spread this function across 6, 7, 8 different people, all trying to pull data and reporting to understand what's happening, and they're not really telling a story, that's not the most efficient way of getting this job done, right? Now, I also should note that the web analyst role may be a federal employee, but it can also be a designated contractor role. So myself, I'm a contractor that supports the DAP program, right? And there are other agencies that do similar things with internal folks, federal employees, and there are other agencies that use contractors. So all to say, your mileage is going to vary, you know, based on how lucky you are to have somebody at your agency who is willing to dive in and learn this stuff, or if you just rather go the route of working with a contracting company. So the big takeaway here is the type of web analyst you need needs to be custom fit to your organization's reporting needs and level of support from other teams like your web development team. This is not something the DAP team can tell you how to do. This needs to come from an honest and frank strategic discussion about what are the gaps we're trying to fill, what are our pain points, and how do we find a web analyst that helps address those challenges, gaps, and pain points. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how you need to think about justifying a web analyst role on your team. Overall, you really need to just focus on communicating the value of a web analyst to your organization. What challenges and problems and gaps is this person going to help solve? That is how you position the business value of a web analyst to your organization and your senior leadership. So, simply put, a web analyst helps the organization by helping your agency focus its resources on areas of high interest among your engaged visitors. So for example, which type of content is your audience consuming and why? What type of search experiences result in a higher overall satisfaction? You need a web analyst to help you figure out which areas to prioritize and which areas to deprioritize. So, you know, really looking at this type of data from this perspective in the federal government space is helping provide direction and guidance for your agency to really look at how you can improve public awareness, right? That's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to improve the user experience. We're trying to help your agency engage with the public, with other government agencies. You need somebody who's able to help the organization in this way. So how do I make the business case for a web analyst to my leadership team? Well, I'm sure a lot of folks are asking this question right now. Well, I like to talk about, again, the concept of garbage in, garbage out. The skill set of a web analyst needs to be a function of your agency's challenges and support gaps. You need to think about what are the problems that we're trying to solve for. And then you need to position the type of web analyst that you want to hire to fix those problems, right? And you need to do that upfront strategy work. If you hire the wrong type of web analyst, you're not going to yield the type of work product and support to fix the problems that your organization has today, to fill in those gaps, to provide the data, insights, and storytelling. Now, according to Gartner, As organizations digitally transform, as they add digital processes across all of their business, including the products themselves, data and analytics are becoming increasingly important. I'll talk a little bit about this when we get to some real world examples in just a few slides, but in anything tech related, data is important. You can make the business case to your leadership team that data sources and the complexity of data and understanding how effective we are as an organization in engaging with the public is really important to be analyzed so that we can understand how successful we are and how to prioritize certain tasks and certain goals of our agency. Following up on that, according to the IDC, industries are making large investments in big data, and the federal government is one of those industries. Now, in 2020, they're estimating that 5 industries will account for nearly 91.4, nearly half of $91.4 billion of worldwide revenue. And the federal government accounts for approximately 7% of this, or about 6.2 billion. So if you think about your agency, there is tons of data being created about your website, your engagement with your marketing audiences. You need to look at how the federal government is today forecasting how they're going to be spending this money, right? There's clearly a focus on providing data analysis. So you can use this to justify to your leadership team the need for a web analyst. Additionally, for how you can make the business case for a web analyst to your leadership team, I would recommend focusing on policies that help you justify having a web analyst, because data analysis is a key part of 2 acts. There's the IDEA Act, right? The IDEA Act requires agencies to focus on user-centered design. The only way you can know if user-centered design is successful or not is looking at your data and conducting data analysis. So this lends itself to data analysis and having that conversation with your leadership team about the need for a web analyst. Second policy is the CX CAP goal for customer service. You can use this policy to encourage your agency to use data analysis to analyze and meet your CAP customer satisfaction goal KPIs. These are all ways that you can look at policies today and communicate the need and the value that a web analyst would bring to your team. So highly encourage you to look at these different policies, see how they apply specifically to your agency, how your agency views these policies, and work backwards from there to figure out what data analytics function needs to happen within the context of these policies and your agency. Okay, so I'm going to go into some feedback here from real people who I interviewed and brainstormed with on this webinar. At the GSA, we are very fortunate to work with a lot of great teams. And one of those teams, our colleagues at USA.gov, we had the pleasure of meeting with and hearing their thoughts and feedback on how they have made the business case for having analysts, web analytics functions integrated into their team. And so over the next 3 slides, I'm just going to talk a little bit about their feedback when we went to them to brainstorm about how their team thinks about making the business case and why it is so important to have a web analyst doing this job. Now, the reason why we're telling you all of this information is that you can get these anecdotes so that you can explain this type of business case to your leadership team and see the thought process through which various folks on other teams are using when they're thinking about how to justify having a web analyst on their team. So we met with David Kaufman, who's a program analyst on USA.gov. He is a very expert level analyst in Google Analytics and Google Tag Manager. Some takeaways from my conversations and interview with David were that website architecture And technology needs to help your team determine what kind of skills you need from an analyst. So again, this is a recurring theme that we've talked about here today. Your specific agency's tech stack, your website, any technology, any web dev support that you have today, all of that is going to help you inform and figure out what type of web analyst you need to hire. If you have a team and you don't have a lot of hours from your web development team, maybe you need to hire a web analyst that has a web development background. But you wouldn't know if you needed that type of support unless you've looked at strategically, how is our team set up today, and what level of support do we have, and what technical resources do we have, right? So there needs to be that upfront conversation about what are the challenges and what are the gaps that we need to fill. Dave also talked about, assessing their organization's tech stack, support and challenges, and you need to really communicate these challenges to your senior leadership. The value of a web analyst, according to David, is that a web analyst helps people not waste time and be more efficient by being able to focus on analytics. So a big chunk of what David does is that he uses analytics to help his team be more efficient. So they typically look at different areas of USA.gov, and they look at engagement on those different areas. And that helps them prioritize what areas of the website need to be updated sooner rather than later, right? They're able to create a queue of what content needs to be constantly being updated based on actual user engagement with that content, right? Another good point that David made was that you really need someone to air traffic control and help prioritize what to work on and what not to work on, right? Only focus on things that don't, you don't want to focus on things that don't have much of an impact. That's really the takeaway. Additionally, David mentioned that there are so many data types out there, right? This is complicated, and yet there is so much value to be had from the data that you really do need somebody managing the collection, analysis, and then helping people understand what it means. You can't have somebody doing this on the side. And I know that's a situation, it's a common scenario that we all have experienced in the federal government space, where we're really kind of spreading the pain of trying to figure out and reverse engineer the data on top of our day jobs. But really to really make that shift, you need to be looking at having one person, or perhaps one person who that's half their job, right? Looking at the data, its collection, its analysis, and how you can tell a story and glean insights and make recommendations from that data. If you're having 5 or 6 people pull the same reports on page views, that's not going to be an impactful report or way of approaching data and making change in your organization. Another person we talked to was Mary Beth Murphy. She's the analytics team lead for USA.gov. She had a really good piece of feedback when we were talking about the value of a web analyst and how should other agencies think about justifying the role of a web analyst on their team. And she noted that without analytics, you're producing a product blindly. You need to have expertise in managing data, whether that be Google Analytics, social, phone, chat, survey, contact center data. You need a high level of technical expertise, folks who know how to use the tools, folks who use Tableau to visualize the data. Having a separate team of analysts allows you to have objectivity. So I love this quote because it really speaks to all the advantages that you get by having an objective person only focused on the data, right? You need somebody who lives and breathes the data, who's able to navigate the nuances and gray area of data challenges that we all experience today, right? And if you don't have somebody that's doing this, you're never really going to reach a place where you're able to give recommendations or create insights. And in some level, Mary Beth is very right. You're going to be producing a product blindly. Who wants to do that? We all want to do the right thing with our websites, improve the user experience for our customers, for the public. That's really what we're here to do with web and data analytics. And then finally, we had the opportunity to speak with Jessica Milsatich, who's the Director of Customer Experience at USA.gov. And she had a really great quote that I really resonated with me, and that's, without a data analyst, you can't do anything. How do you make a decision if you don't have anyone who can help you make sense of the data? Now, what I love about this quote is that she's not thinking in terms of page views, like a lot of government agencies do today. She's thinking about making decisions, and that's key here. The whole point of a web analyst and a data analyst is to use the data to make recommendations, to help your senior leadership make a decision about the usability of a site, about a particular feature of a site, and so on. So you really need a true data mindset and ability to understand this data at a deeper level. And you can only get so far if you only have a few people who do this kind of on the side for 30 minutes a week, looking at DAP data or survey data. You know, you could know just enough to be dangerous, but this is only going to get you so far. Okay, so let's talk about how to calculate how many web analysts you, in theory, might need. Well, there's a couple factors to consider. Now, we at the DAP program cannot tell you how many analysts you're going to need, right? That's a function of how your organization is set up. What are your gaps? What are the challenges you're up against? But consider these factors. How many hours does it take to service your internal client reporting needs? Do you have one person who spends 25 hours a week pulling reports and analyzing data, or do you have 7 people spending 50 hours a week pulling reports for internal clients and senior leadership, right? These are important questions that only you can answer. The next factor to consider is, how much tech support do you have today? If you don't have any tech support, whether that be from the web development team or somebody else in your team, you need to factor in the number of additional hours your analyst is going to need to implement these tools and provide tech support. Now, that's not something we can tell you at the DAP program, but that is something that we can help you think about and go back to your agency after this webinar today and start having these conversations with senior leadership about what might that look like? How many hours, what might we need? Now, one other way to think about this is in terms of the work week, the 40-hour work week. If you are able to tally 40 hours of work per week, that could be a good indication of how many web analysts you need. So if you've got 40 hours of work that happens across X number of people, it might behoove you, and it might make sense to have one analyst. Now, this is obviously not a science, right? We're just thinking in terms of real world, work hours. Your mileage is going to vary here because every organization and every team is different. Also, you need to be thinking about and considering the time and effort of posting a job, whether that be for internal federal employees, for the public. All of that is a factor, and you need to be aware of that. Additionally, if you're going to go the contractor route to get like a federal contracting company, what is the time for awarding that type of contract? These are all things that have downstream impacts on your ability to get this reporting web analyst function filled. And then finally, what is your funding? What's your budget? What makes sense, right? These are not things the DAP team can tell you how to think, how to approach, but these are things that you have to deal with internally at your agency to figure out what actually is possible from a funding and budgeting perspective. Okay, so in conclusion, understanding your agency's level of technical support and gaps is going to help you understand what skills you need in a web analyst. Additionally, you need to figure out the number of hours your team uses today to pull reporting so that you can estimate or guesstimate whether you should ask for one or many web analysts, right? You also need to think about where there are gaps in your reporting and analysis today. What would it take to close those gaps to get a complete understanding of your data? And then finally, make the business case to your senior leadership by communicating the challenges you experience at your agency. And also reference government-wide initiatives like CAP and the IDEA Act as justification in addition to the analysis that you're doing on number of hours your team pulls reporting today to make the business case to your senior leadership for a web analyst role. Okay, so that was a lot. We are coming up on time. We've got a few minutes, but want to encourage everyone on here on this webinar to please contact us at dap@support.digitalgov.gov if you'd like to brainstorm further on how to structure your team or have these conversations, or if you have any questions on today's webinar. Very happy to discuss these things, trade ideas, provide feedback. By all means, please contact us at that email address. We're always happy to collaborate. And with that, this is the end of today's webinar. I want to say thank you for taking time out of your day to attend today's webinar. We will be posting a video of this. Please feel free to forward this to other colleagues, team members who might be interested in this topic. And again, thank you all for your time. We would really appreciate your feedback on the survey so that we can continue to develop interesting and useful webinars in the future for the DAP community. I want to thank everyone again for your time. Thank you.
Hey, Freddie. So great job. We have 3 minutes and tons of questions.
Great.
There's been a robust discussion going on. I'm gonna maybe consolidate some of them.
Sure.
But one of the ones that's been coming up among a few people here is sort of how do you handle not having responsive leadership when you're attempting to sort of communicate that either somebody could be hired or that somebody could shift to have more of an official role to be a web analyst when you're not getting that type of responsivity from senior leadership? Do you have recommendations about how to handle that?
That's a great question. Well, in all the organizations I've worked in, primarily private sector e-commerce, I've run into the same issues. I think there's always going to be a certain degree of politics. The best that you can do is highlight the gaps, right? Highlight the challenges and how hiring a web analyst is going to fill those gaps. And not only that, highlight the CAP and the IDEA Act as being government-wide initiatives that we need to all be aware of and make sure that we're complying with, right? We need some way and somebody to analyze these data sets to help us work with and abide by the IDEA Act and the CAP.
Yeah, I mean, I echo that. I think when all else fails, try to fall back on policy. And luckily, there are some policies that certainly could help you here. I think that this question's probably, the million-dollar question. Another thing that was interesting is somebody who's watching commented money. And maybe that's the case. Maybe that's your angle. If you can argue that having one person on your team that is focused on doing these things, one of the great things David Kaufman mentioned was if you have someone who's very efficient at doing this, you're saving actually a lot of time and potentially bad data by doing the spray and pray across many people. So if you have folks that are really struggling to try to make sense of data and it's taking them much longer to do so versus having one person who gets really, really good at doing it and does it efficiently and can tell good stories, maybe that's an argument that you could have as well.
That's a great point.
Another thing some folks mentioned here, we're talking about if there are sort of standard SOWs and or position descriptions that describe how this could work. And I'm going to take it upon myself to attempt to do a collection of that afterward. We can talk to our community and see if folks can send us the SOWs if they're public, or the position descriptions for folks that they've hired in the past. And we will try to find a way in the coming weeks to have some sort of database or compilation of that for you all. I do want to also note, just on one separate topic here, that while Freddie was talking a lot about things that you could consider regarding hiring someone new, certainly if you have the ability to do some training and to allow someone to devote some time to get some experience on a lot of these tools, I think it's also very possible that you can take folks you already have and just give them specifically as a duty of theirs, to be able to do some of these things. I can speak on my personal experience. I was not hired into government to do Google Analytics work, and I just happened to get involved in the digital analytics program years ago, and now it ended up being something that I do as my full-time job. So I think that there's a little bit of wiggle room there, just acknowledging as a federal employee that the federal hiring process is not always extremely friendly. I don't want to take up too much more time, but some of the other things that folks asked, one person asked if you have any experience in integrating CRM tools with analytic tools. I personally don't. I don't know if you do.
I've worked on Google Analytics and Salesforce. So there are hooks and there are different CRM tools. Your mileage is going to vary depending on what type of support that CRM tools have for Google Analytics. It really just depends on what tool set you're using.
Great. And I just want to read very quickly before we wrap up. I want to read something that Crystal Bird from our colleague here at GSA had posted, because I think it's really prescient. This info is very helpful, but just know that even if you get a web analyst, it may be a challenging road forward. Even with a web analyst and usability team, sometimes it's very hard to integrate recommendations into underlying business processes that are not human-centered. The broader challenge is, how do we change the culture to value data-informed decisions? And doing that from the bottom up is super tough. And I think that Freddie and I would both agree with you there, Crystal. And we certainly empathize that sometimes trying to defeat processes that have been in place for a long time is a difficult road forward. And I don't think anyone has a magic bullet for that. Freddie, I don't know. Do you have a magic bullet for that?
I do not, and that definitely resonates, Crystal. Yeah, definitely understand and sharing that in that sentiment.
With that, in the essence of time, I know we're a couple minutes over. I apologize if there were folks where I said that I would read the question in the Q&A portion and I didn't get to you. Please feel free to email us, specifically at dap@support.digitalgov.gov. And Freddie, if you want to give us a closing.
Great. Well, thank you all for attending today. By all means, please fill out the survey feedback. We definitely appreciate it. Thank you again to Tim for monitoring the chats today, and thank you to the DigitalGov team for, as always, helping us present these webinars. And thank you all for attending, and stay safe and healthy.